All right, everyone. Well, welcome again. Today we're here with Dr. David Pilgrim, who is the founder and director of the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Imagery and the vice president of Diversity, Inclusion, and Strategic Initiative Office at Ferris State University. Dr. Pilgrim, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I look forward to talking with you.
So I want to kind of jump right in. Most of the audience understands when we say Jim Crow what we're talking about. For those who might not, can you talk to us a little bit about the era and time of what we're talking about here in America?
Yeah, we're talking about a period between, let's say, the 1870s and the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
This was a period when in the United States we had what in effect was a racial hierarchy. It looked in some ways like a racial caste system.
Right.
It operated primarily, but not exclusively, in southern and border states. It was more than a set of laws.
Mm-hmm.
It was a way of life, quite frankly, where everything white was considered superior to everything not white. And that was reflected in attitudes, tastes, values, laws, customs, and quite frankly, even in the objects that the nation produced.
And that's what we're really talking about, is the idea of this racist imagery, and how. And I know it's propaganda is sort of the short answer, but why so much? Why was so much of this imagery used coming out of the Civil War, and going into this idea of emancipation? These images sort of pop up almost out of nowhere overnight. What was it about this era that really drove the reproduction of these images?
Well, you cannot oppress a people without some things being in place. One is the threat of violence. You have to have real violence, but you also have the threat of violence. And then you have to have your major societal institutions, the family, government, media, religion. All your institutions have to be on board with this oppression. But then that oppression is also reflected in the objects that a nation produces. And so one of the things I tell people is that if you show me the objects a nation produces, I will tell you about their attitudes, tastes, values, and behaviors, because those objects, they both shape and reflect. You used the word propaganda. There's not a better word, right? I mean,
right.
They both shaped and reflected attitudes toward Black people. And so they were important, right? I mean, they helped sustain the system.
Mm-hmm. And I really draw back to that era, because thinking about how Birth of a Nation really sort of makes this notion that the African American male is a savage beast and only there to rape white women, and that visually we get that from Birth of a Nation, which goes down unfortunately as one of the greatest films in American history because of the film itself, but the story is so convoluted. But that so much of that we do start seeing over and over again in a lot of these images. Can you speak to why these images stuck so powerfully as part of this tool?
Well, I'm just thinking, I mean, there's so many ways to approach that. First of all, you had the birth of blackface minstrelsy. Actually, most historians would argue that's where the term Jim Crow came from.
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure, but I'm sure that it became popular through a stage character who got on the stage, blackened his face. Wasn't the first to do that, wasn't the first to do it in the US, but certainly was the first to become famous and rich from doing it. And so in the US, you have images, depictions, portrayals of African Americans on stage that show them as lesser beings. Okay. And that becomes a legitimization of the racial hierarchy, because why you want to let these people vote? They're buffoons, they are menaces to society. Why would you consider allowing them in your schools, in your neighborhoods? Certainly you would not consider marrying them,
right?
And so those portrayals of African Americans, whether they were in movies later, or were on a minstrel stage, or were in the jokes that were told, or later, as you mentioned, were in the three-dimensional objects produced, they all did the same thing, which was to support the narrative, this sort of national racial script. And I mean, it's not a deep answer, but I'm pretty sure it's the accurate one.
Right.
That it was just necessary, because the system could not be supported without those stools, if you would, those legs to the stool. Violence, the negative portrayals, and the sort of the rationalization that you got from the major societal institutions, which said, yeah, of course, those people are not like we are.
Right. And you say that it's needed to support that system. And can you speak a little more to that? Because, again, when we talk about the end of the Civil War and we think about this idea of emancipation, oh, well, everyone's free. But there was this humongous sort of machine at play
Mhm,
that said, okay,
mhm.
we can't hold slaves, but how else do we continuously oppress a people
Yeah,
and still get this labor out of them?
yeah, yeah. So one of the I sometimes hear people, they confuse the term caricature with stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
Really, a caricature is an attempt to flatten a whole person and make them one or two dimensional, and then you overlay onto that certain stereotypes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about it, during the enslavement period, you had certain caricatures. For example, the caricature of the mammy. Now, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of what we think of the mammy actually came after the enslavement period, um, but the mammy was someone who was portrayed as being docile and who was, quite frankly, loving white people, not loving their own family, asexual or desexualized, but fiercely loyal to white people. The male counterpart to that would have been, say, the Tom.
Mm-hmm.
Then you would have had the so-called coon, who was this, forgive my impression, but Oz will be going home now, boss. It's kind of Sambo type
Right.
figure. Well, after the enslavement period, the fears of many white people uh, were addressed by the creation of a new caricature, and that was the so-called brute.
Mm-hmm.
And this was the portrayal of African Americans, again, primarily but not exclusively young males, as menaces to society. Who's going to rape white women and murder white men. And so this, you start hearing about the black brute and this savage, this innate criminality that was supposedly in black people, especially young black men. Well, that became a justification for over 4,000 lynchings. It became a justification for uh, race riots led by whites against black communities. But what it really became a justification was the maintenance of the racial justice system,
Mm-hmm.
so that it became a social. These caricatures reflected, again, sometimes in material objects, but sometimes in jokes or sermons or lectures or whatever. They became ways to say that the system was legitimate. And so, in other words, the objects can't be taken out of their relationship. They should be viewed in their relationship to everything else that was going on in the society. So they were a part of this unholy alliance of really bad things used to substantiate the racial justice. I mean, not the racial justice, the racial hierarchy in our society.
Mhm. And you talk about the idea of jokes and sermons and all of the little things that we also sort of let slide. But it
Mhm,
feels like when you add the jokes that you're telling your friends and the sermon that you hear on Sunday morning, and you're driving home and you see the lawn jockey and you're in the
mhm,
store and you see the ad, that it's almost this piling on of none of it
absolutely.
individually
Mhm,
is all that bad. But when you
mhm,
look at it all together,
mhm.
this is sort of what we're saying about society.
Absolutely. And the I tell you, I've studied race for a lot more than, for a long time, and I've collected these objects for over 4 decades, right? And you can't have that kind of journey, where literally a journey in the sense that going from state to state, city to city, but I'm meaning more just a journey of understanding. you can't have that without every now and again something just hitting you so hard.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a doctorate in in sociology, so I took all the courses that people take in race relations and all of that. But one day, it just really hit me, the depth of the, I don't know any other way to say it, the hatred and disdain that many white Americans had for black people in this country. And it's just it's simply, when I hear people say that, sometimes in frustration, you hear a young brother or sister will say, "Oh, things are just as bad as they were, 100 years ago," and 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 that's just not true. The reality is we're probably more democratic and egalitarian than we've ever been the last 10 years or so, notwithstanding. But part of that is because we had so far to go.
Mm.
And I'll give you an example I rarely use because I don't, I think it's almost overkill. But I started studying when I was at undergrad at Jarvis Christian College, was a historically black school out in Texas. I remember one of my teachers one time, they were talking about how Nat Turner, when he was, captured and he executed, how his body was mutilated, and that someone had made grease out of his skin or something. And it was such a horrific, ghastly kind of story, but it kind of got locked in my head. Now, a lot of times when we hear these things, they're not true. But I started doing research years and years later when we finally got the tools to do really good newspaper research. Because I have a couple of applications that search millions of pages of newspapers as quickly as Google, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I just typed in one day um, something like Negro skin or Negro leather or something like that. And it started me on probably a year
Oh wow.
of looking at newspaper articles where, in a matter of fact way, the authors would talk about how there was a case of someone wearing shoes that were made from the skin of a black person, or
Oh my God.
a belt that was made, or pretty much anything that was made out of leather. Now, of course, these were only the these were the only stories I could find that were in newspapers. Obviously, it's likely that this happened much more often than just that. But I found dozens and dozens and dozens over many decades. Um, and I remember one time, and speaking of just, I was talking about that
Mhm.
epiphany about just the great hatred or disdain for black people. Was that there was a story of a white woman. I wrote about this in one of my books, but of a white woman who was wearing some luxurious shoes made out of a black, and it was next to the box scores of the baseball games from that day, the two stories. And
Wow.
so, in just a matter of fact way, you get where I'm going.
Yep.
And
Yep.
so, in order to really understand America's past, racial past, um, you have to deal with the worst of it. Uh, but you can't do that if you're afraid of the past. And one of the things I say is that Americans like happy history, the kind of history where you have parades and you talk about that you can talk about in smug conversations
Mm-hmm.
and the like. But if we're to become a truly a just society, right? That city on the top of the hill.
Mm-hmm.
If we're to become that, we have to deal with the worst of it.
Yeah.
And a lot of the worst of it occurred years after the enslavement period.
And that's one of those things in my own research that I found is that we look at enslavement and we look at the Civil War and at the end of it and like, oh wow, it's finally over. But that so much of this, I mean, the KKK comes around after the end of enslavement,
Hmm.
and the idea of, the Daughters of the Revolution, we look at the
Hmm.
Confederate monuments,
Hmm.
all of these things come after that
Mm-hmm.
as sort of this pushback to, well, now that we freed you, we're not ready for
Mm-hmm.
that. So there's this
Mm-hmm.
pushback.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're right that that's that ugly part of history that no one wants to really admit, is that
Mm-hmm.
while it looks like, well, we ended slavery, no, we just shifted gears
Mm-hmm.
and found a
Mm-hmm.
new way to oppress that was actually much, much worse almost at
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
times.
Yeah, and I think, first time I heard sort of the idea of you know debt slavery, or what is it called, convict labor and the like.
Mm-hmm.
My first thought was, because I grew up in Alabama, and I started thinking about like the so-called chain gangs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the images that I had seen of them. And then, there's a wonderful book out called Slavery by Another Name. And if you come from where I come from down south, I mean, you see the residue of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so when people talk about, or ask the question, why are we still talking about these things? Slavery ended, a zillion years ago, in what is it, 1865. So why are we still having this conversation?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're still having this conversation because we still live in the residue.
Right.
And that does not mean that we have not made progress. But on the other hand, and that's one of the things that I tell people when they come to the museum, we have all these horrific objects in there. Every one of those objects you could buy today. And you can go to eBay or
Mm-hmm.
Cafe Press or any of these internet auction houses and just think of a race-based word, and you'll pull up these objects. Um, Again, it doesn't mean we haven't made progress, but we still live in the residue. And until we can recognize that, we can't get better, as a nation. The trick is not to stop talking about race; it's to find better ways, more honest ways to talk about race. So, like in the museum, one of the things we've done is we've sort of changed. I don't know if you call it our slogan or motto or something. It used to be like using objects of intolerance to teach tolerance, and now what we want to focus on are three words: witness, understand, and heal.
Okay.
And so we're building a new facility. By the way,
Mm-hmm.
thanks for giving me the opportunity to share that. And in that, what we're going to show is during the Jim Crow period, we're going to show Black people pushing back,
Okay.
and we're going to show real time pushback. So
Mm-hmm.
if we're talking about the 1930s, we're going to show the African Americans who were using their activism, their personal achievements, and quite frankly, just trying to live their lives with dignity as ways to push back.
No, I appreciate that. And I definitely want to come back around and talk about sort
Okay.
of the future of the museum,
Okay.
and where that's going. But I want to talk about the collection. So you said you've been collecting these objects for over 40 years.
Yep.
How and why did you get started? And it's one of those, I remember in my old neighborhood, there was a house, a block behind us that had the black lawn jockeys,
Yeah.
and riding by all the time. And once I was old enough to understand what they represented, and it was a black family who lived there, I understood the disconnect, that they didn't understand what it represented, and it was just part of Americana to them. But it really is so much worse than that it's a part of the sort of racist history. Why in the world for over 40 years are you collecting these things?
Yeah. Listen. I wish I had a great answer. What I'll say is I was actually born in New York. I was
Hmm.
raised from before I turned one down in Mobile, and my folks are sub-Saharan African and Venezuelan and Indian or
Hmm.
indigenous. Um, so in Alabama, that's black,
Yep.
and it especially was black in right at the end of the Jim Crow period. And so, being sort of a multiracial black man, I thought about race all the time, but even before I became a man. And I've told the story before, but the first piece I bought, I was at like a hybrid. It was kind of like a carnival, but it was a carnival that had dealers that had whatnots on tables that they were selling,
Hmm.
and I bought. I couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old. I bought it. It was certainly cheap because I know I didn't have any money. And then I broke it right in front of the guy. I guess I don't know. I just didn't like it. I didn't break the second piece or third piece. I don't even remember collecting the second or third piece. But in those days, I grew up in all black neighborhoods, so the stuff I saw was in black people's homes.
Yeah.
It wasn't the really, let's be clear though, it wasn't the really harsh, you know, segregation pieces, but there were things like, Mammy figures,
Hmm.
Tom figures, and a lot of figures that portrayed black people as dumb, or naked, near naked, that kind of thing. And then I went and I kept collecting. I didn't have a lot of pieces in that time. And then when I went to college at Jarvis again, out in Texas. It was there that almost, I would say, three-fourths of my teachers were African Americans, and from them, they really taught the lessons of Jim Crow, like
Gotcha.
what it was like for them to have grown up during Jim Crow. And but the other thing they taught was how to use objects as teaching tools.
Okay.
And so I had already started collecting. And so I started adding a few pieces here and there. And then when I got to Ohio State for graduate school, I was just full on collecting. And never, I didn't have a lot of space, didn't have a lot of money. And then I would say it was probably in the late 80s, 90s, when I came here to Fair State, finally got a steady job and had a little money and just started buying up people's collections. And I had started doing that a little bit before this, but and then it just kind of took off. So now, I donated my collection to the university. I don't know, around 1990 or something, a 91 or whatever, and it was probably 3,500 pieces. Now we have over 30,000 pieces.
Wow.
So, but let me tell you this one story though. There was the university had given me a really small room, and it was like 500 square feet. It was
Hmm.
just visual storage. And someone came in and they're like, "Hey, I know a woman who has a collection like this. You should meet her." So they told me where she was. She was an elderly African American woman. She liked me because I was from down home,
Hmm.
and so we spent a lot of time together. I used to joke that I basically was dating her, even though she was like 40 years my senior. But she wouldn't let me see her collection
Oh wow.
because she said if I ever saw her collection, I was going to want it. And I promised her that I said, no, I'm not going to want it. I promise you, I'm not going to want it. And it took forever, but eventually she let me see her collection. And of course, I
You
wanted it
wanted it.
more than anything I've ever wanted in my life. She had converted an old. She was an antique dealer, so
Hmm.
she had a few pieces in her storefront. But her collection was actually a little distance away in a barn. And brother, I tell you what, it was every racist, anti-black material object that you could imagine, and
Wow.
thousands of pieces. I mean, from floor to ceiling. She had shelves in there, and some of the stuff I had seen in books, some I had seen in my travels, some I owned, but the sheer volume of it was just overwhelming. And I think it was at that time I decided, rather than just using these as teaching tools when I give talks, whatever, I need to create something like what she has here, but do it a little more academically.
Hmm.
And now the sad epilogue to the story is that I eventually I went out to California for something, and while I was out there, she passed away, and her kids, it did not take them a day or two to sell everything that
Oh
she had.
man.
And so, but it was, first of all, it was great knowing her.
Hmm.
And so I feel blessed to have had the opportunity to spend some time with her. But it also planted the seed because I had no intention of creating any type of museum
Hmm.
until I saw her place.
That's wow. That's inspiring, but also sad. The notion that it was sold off so quickly.
Mhm.
But the fact that you got to see it
Mhm.
and that sort of planted that seed. So, can you talk to us a little bit about what is the museum? So, we've talked about sort of the Jim Crow era and these images. So, what is this museum? If someone comes to Fair State in its current form, because there is
Mhm.
the expansion you're working
Mhm.
about, what should we expect to see?
Yeah, so we have on display probably 7,000 pieces. We start by introducing the person to who was Jim Crow.
Hmm.
Then we introduce them to objects which help us answer the question, what was Jim Crow, the system?
Gotcha. Mm-hmm.
Then we show the relationship between Jim Crow and violence. And then that's the toughest period. Toughest section, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And then the biggest part of the current facility is a section on the everyday objects that supported Jim Crow. And so that people would find in their homes, in their kitchens, their bathrooms, in their yards. And so that's really where we have our best conversations. And then after that, we have a section on how African Americans start pushing back. In our current place, it's small, but it's there. And then finally, we have a section on brand new objects.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the most powerful things. Because of our name, people think this is all just about the past, but we still collect objects. So when there's a race-based incident that receives any type of national attention, there are 2- and 3-dimensional objects that are created, within a week.
Wow.
So we have a whole section on objects that defame and mock President Obama.
Gotcha.
When they had the white supremacists down in Virginia with the tiki torches.
Oh yeah.
We went got one of the tiki torches. Because for us, what we believe that objects, they're not only teaching tools, they're also evidence. And so whether we're talking about evidence of progress or evidence for the need for progress, we collect evidence and then we contextualize it.
It is weird and sad to think about the idea that they're still creating objects that are meant to demean and do all of these things. And in the modern world, even though we've learned sort of the impact that these have in the past, and maybe it's because of that impact is why they're still creating them, because they know that they're such effective tools. So
and it's the old ideas just morphed into the present, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's nothing new about African Americans being portrayed as simians.
Mm-hmm.
But there is something new about President Obama being portrayed as a monkey.
Gotcha.
And so, we have, probably 20 objects that people were selling or displaying or whatever. The same thing with, I was just thinking there's, I have a great deal of respect for LeBron James. I do not think he was the best basketball player of all time. That's Michael Jordan or Kareem.
Mm-hmm.
Kareem. But anyway, or Wilt for that matter. But anyhow, I have a lot of respect for what he's done in especially in the Akron community and Cleveland, and I just think he's helped a lot of people. But there's a cover, I think, of Vogue magazine.
Vogue magazine with Giselle Bundchen on it. Yep.
Yeah. So, brother, you're not as woke as you think you are if you allow yourself, to do that. That's why we have to remain vigilant.
Yeah.
I'll give you another example. I don't know if you remember Don Imus.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, so remember when he made his unfortunate comment about the women's basketball team, about them being, used.
Rutgers nappy-headed something. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm telling you, it was not a week later before there were pillows, like pillowcases and actual pillows that had what he said on them.
Wow.
That's what I mean. Another example would be like the shooting targets that have Trayvon Martin or that have George Floyd on them. Well, these are Jim Crow ideas, but we're not in the Jim Crow period.
Right.
Okay. When I have a T-shirt that says any white guy in 2012 for president.
Got
all right. So that's not the Jim Crow period. And by the way, that's succinct, right?
Mm-hmm.
That pretty much sums it up. Any white guy in 2012. So again, it's not to suggest that we have not made progress, but it is to demand that we remain vigilant.
Mm-hmm. No, and I appreciate that. And I think that that's one of those things that gets lost sometimes in the idea of progress. And I always think of Malcolm X, you can't stab me in the back with a 6-inch blade and pull it out 3 inches and call it, and ask me to forgive you. Mm-hmm. We still have a lot further to go because the damage is still there. And so I appreciate that notion that, there are still things that are happening. I was looking at the website and started part of the virtual tour. And one of the things that I appreciated in the virtual tour is that it also starts before 16 1919.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a section that looks at
Oh,
the
yeah.
idea of Africans before slavery and
Yeah.
this notion that most people think of African American and African history,
Yeah.
and we think of slavery, but guess what? Africa is much older than that. And so could you
Absolutely.
speak to a little bit about the importance of including that in the museum?
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned that. So this is, sometimes the most important points are just the simplest one. And here's the simple point. The experience of African people in the universe did not begin with enslavement in this country. And we want to start from that. All right. And so, and by the way, we have a small, you saw the virtual tour, so it's very small. We have hundreds of pieces there.
Yeah.
And so in the next place, we will expand on a couple of the accomplishments, achievements, civilizations, and the like. But yeah, it's for us again, just a simple point. We want to set the tone because from the time that Africans were enslaved in this country, began the sort of destruction of the humanity of African people. Again, in science, we have all kind of science, so-called science books. They're actually pseudoscientific books, making assumptions about African people. And again, that became part of the foundation for the subsequent mistreatment, the enslavement, and then the re-enslavement, and then the segregation that was meted out against Black people. So I'm glad you picked up on that. It's a story we're going to expand on. But right now, we want to start with that, though.
Yeah. Well, no, I think it's important because I think it was Jefferson or maybe it was Edison. I remember there's a reading somewhere that at one point, no, it was Jefferson who asked scientists to give him proof that Africans were subhuman. Not are they? Find me the proof. And that was the directive. And so that what came back was in fact that pseudoscience, because they had to create something to appease the president. And that's where a basis of a lot of this is coming from. And so I appreciate that that's where you want to start, is the idea of, just so you know, enslavement isn't all of our history, and it won't be the final footnote either. There's more to it, but this is what we're looking at in this moment.
And it wasn't the first of our history.
Yeah.
It's kind of like when, well, I don't want to make an analogy. I was going to make an analogy. Then I'd have to, then that would get convoluted. So, right.
No, I appreciate that. And so one of the other things that I kind of want to talk on is in modern time, we see this sort of pulling back. We've lost, the notion of Aunt Jemima, and everyone, oh my God, I can't believe you're ruining this tradition, this history. It's like, well, no, it was very racist, and we've taken Uncle Ben off of the rice in these things. How do you feel about sort of these changes? Is this something that's a good progress forward, because we're removing these sort of mascots and images, but we also run the risk of losing the story of how we got there? Where do you sit on those things?
Yeah, well, so I'm fairly direct about this. I consider it a victory every time one of those is removed. And quite frankly, if you go in the museum and you look at the objects, what you'll find are hundreds that met their end long before Aunt Jemima. Aunt Jemima was a holdout, right? Because people go, well, it's iconic. Yeah, it's iconic of the wrong kinds of things, right?
Right.
I remember years ago, I was in my office and somebody called me. They were doing consumer research representing the company. I get the companies mixed up now. They've changed hands a couple of times. But they were hired to figure out, should they make some changes to Aunt Jemima? Now, this was probably the 1990s. So the depiction of Aunt Jemima it wasn't as caricatured as years before. It actually looked like my aunt, right? And so they were like wondering, should they go the next step? Because, they wanted to keep it, but they wanted to, kind of go the next step. They'd already removed the kerchief from the head. And so I said, well, let's talk about it. I says, well, here's a couple of thoughts. I said, I don't have a problem with the name Jemima, because Jemima's a name, right? You go to West Indies, that's just a name. It's not in and of itself racialized, but aunt is a racial name. So why not you just call her Jemima? They were like, yeah, I don't know about that. I was like, okay. I was like, all right, well, here's something. Why not let her also eat, right? I mean, I've been around Black folks my whole life. I know Black folks eat. So why let her sit at the table. Kind of like with the Uncle Ben guy, right? He's
Mhm.
not only sitting at the table, he's the head of the table, right?
Right.
Now they were like, not that comfortable doing that. I said, well, what about like not having her smile all the time? Because I grew up around what used to be called day work or day laborers.
Mhm.
They were exploited in ways that would turn your stomach. Um, and I was like, well, maybe she can just not look like she's just the happiest person in the world to be serving. Although there's nothing wrong with serving. They're like, no. I was like, you know what? Just give me my check for this time, and then I'm moving on because I've tried to help, and you're not willing to revisit that because, well, quite frankly, because you went to it,
Mhm.
and it's your brand. So when I heard about this, and by the way, and I had lots and lots of conversations with people over the years about Aunt Jemima in particular. And when I heard about it, I was really happy. Now, I'll tell you what I wasn't happy about. What I wasn't happy about is that it took George Floyd, or and often takes a black man being killed in the streets in order to get people to have the kinds of conversations
Mhm.
that we try to have every day in the museum. We're trying to get corporations and churches and police organizations and civic groups to have these conversations all the time. So obviously, I hope we all agree it should not always have to be sparked
Right.
by something like that. And then, I'm just not always sure that the corporations want to sustain the conversations. What they often want to do is get through the period.
Mhm. Mhm.
And to use a kind of 60s, 70s word, they want to pacify
Yeah.
people, and then it's like, okay, well, now this is past and we can get back to business as usual. And so that's disheartening. I thought, that's another long story, but I thought there were some good things that happened during that period, in addition to Aunt
Mhm.
Jemima being being changed. Um, again, some conversations that were supposed to be had. That there were some programs put into place, which was good.
Mhm.
There were some changes made, but it's you can't. It's hard. I shouldn't say you can't. It's hard to sustain um, difficult conversations about race in this culture,
Agreed.
because you got a whole part of our society, including some African Americans, who are just tired and who just wish things were better and think that if they stop talking about them, they'll get better,
Mhm.
which doesn't even make stupid sense. I mean, the reality is, folks, you have to. I mean, you can't be a child as a nation
Mhm.
and prosper, just like we as individuals can't remain children.
Right. I agree. I agree. Thank you for sharing that. So, looking at the museum, then what else, if someone's coming to visit, should they be looking at it? You talked about the brutality parts and some of those things and some of the pieces. But like with the Mamie and the Pickaninny, Sambo and Tom, how many of these different representations and also how are they discussed? Like they're not just on display, but how are
Mhm.
they discussed in a way that is educational and thought provoking?
Well, we try to contextualize probably about 14 or 15 caricatures.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned some of them, right? The Tom, the Sambo, the Coon, and all, which, by the way, are not just caricatures; they're also slurs.
Yeah.
And so we try to help people understand how those terms, ideas, and depictions came into existence.
Mm-hmm.
And then we try to ask the bigger question, which is, what about today? So it's one thing to have a conversation about the past, but you really have to, it's I mean, yes, the museum is about the past, but it's also about today, and quite frankly about the future. I'll give you an example, and I'm sorry,
No, please
I
do,
just
please.
I'm an old southerner, so I get to talking. um, so the games where you throw and you hit something and the person falls down into the dunk tank.
Yep.
All right. So at one time, you actually threw a baseball at an actual person, and they didn't have on most of the time didn't have on a helmet, so you were throwing a hard baseball from not very far at the face
Oh, wow.
of a person. So you could kill the person. You certainly would bust up their face. And so we've done all this research on famous baseball players, Walter Johnson, Ty Cobb, and others, who would go to carnivals and resorts and play this, and they had horrible names like Hit the N Word, African Dodger, these kind of
Yeah.
things, right? And so when people come in the museum, I show them this display, and I ask them, so because they're horrified, and they should be. And I asked them, so how do you think people were able to rationalize hitting another human in the face with a hard object and destroying their face and potentially killing them? And they're like, they don't know. And I says, well, let me help you with this. One of the ways to rationalize it is to say, we're really not hurting them. Their skulls are thicker, their skin is thicker, their brains don't process pain in the same way. Right? So it's okay that I hit them and that I enjoy doing it. And then you're like, well, what does this have to do with the present? Well, one of the things we do in the museum is we show people the research where a sizable minority of healthcare professionals today
Still believe it.
still believe that Black and brown people don't process pain the same way. Well, that's going to matter if you are in the hospital, right? And how gentle you have to be with me, or how rough you can be with me, how much radiation I receive, and the like. So that's what I mean when I say that Jim Crow era attitudes, taste, and values morphed into the present. And by the way, about the facility, one of the weirdest measures of our progress as a nation is that when people come in the museum, unless they're part of some ideological racist group, they come to the museum. They are upset about what they see. That's a measure of progress. Because I tell you this, there was a time in this country when those objects, those depictions would not have upset people, other than Black people. They would not have upset people. And so actually the sense of that's awful is progress.
Yeah.
What I'm concerned about over the last 10 or 12 years is that I have to tell you this. I grew up in Alabama when George Wallace was governor. And I am hearing a level of racial rhetoric in the last decade and plus that is reminiscent of when I grew up in Alabama and a famous white supremacist, a man who was a white supremacist when that was a badge of courage. I'm hearing some of that same rhetoric, and I'm hearing it a lot. And again, I'm not given toward hyperbole. I'm not given toward drama. I'm making an observation. This is what I'm hearing, and this is what I'm seeing. And people have been empowered to act out in those ways again.
And it's sad. It's very sad. My mother's from Alabama as well, Pine Hill. So I know Mobile in those areas. And she often has talked about Wallace. And when she got in trouble for skipping school and marching and the things that he would say. And it's what you said, just really, it brought up a lot of the stories that she used to tell me about growing up in the South. And you're right. Like, it's that same rhetoric. The things that she would say, that Wallace would say, or Bear Bryant would say about Black men playing football for University of Alabama, like the things that would come out of their mouths publicly is more what frightened her, because these were the people who were willing to say this in front of everyone, and you hold a position in which you can actually do something about this. And so I appreciate you saying that, and I think it's something that we need to hear. And I want to go back to what you said about the baseball and the skin and skulls, because one of the real issues about how this is relevant today is that, like, we have an issue when it comes to Black women in maternity. Black women are dying in hospitals, given more C-sections than most women, because they still believe that African African Americans have a higher pain tolerance. And so I can fill my OR with African American women with C-sections as opposed to natural births. And so that you're right, like these echoes still live with us, even though they may have morphed and changed. But the same notion of, oh, well, if I hit him in the head with the baseball, it doesn't matter because he has thick skin and a thick skull. Well, I'll give her a C-section because it doesn't matter because she's got such thick skin and she'll be able to deal with it. Progress, but not much is like there's a whole lot has changed though.
Right. Yeah. So I think that, well, let me put it this way. Almost every adult American I meet is a historian, and they're all bad at it. Because if you start talking to people about the way things used to be, they all have an opinion about the way things used to be, but they don't know what you just said. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
They don't know that they know what they've heard, but they have an idea, and in its worst manifestations, it's this romanticized idea about this America we got to get back to because it was so perfect. It was so. To give you an example of that, when we had 9/11, so I would hear people say these words exactly almost. They would say, this is unusual for the U.S. because this is the first time we've had bombings in the U.S. Now, if you grew up in Alabama,
yes,
the way I did, where we used to refer to Birmingham as Bombingham, okay, and where you had, I mean, quite frankly, you had folks dynamiting people's houses and using all kind of whatever bombing they could do. And if you look at Reverend Dr. King, who lived the last, 13 or 14 years of his life in the valley of the shadow of death before he was killed. There were all kinds of attempts to bomb him. Okay. So that's what, it's like when you don't know history, it's like walking in traffic. You're going to get somebody hurt.
Yeah.
And this idea that the U.S., we've never had bombings means you're not appreciating all of the people that live in this country, because some of us were being bombed.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And I think that's, I remember that time period as well. It was between this is the first time this has happened on American soil.
Yeah.
And then all of the rose colored view of, well, but the day after 9/11, we were all together as one nation. And I was in Michigan at Central Michigan University. And I can tell you that the Muslim students that we had, the community of Dearborn, Michigan, we weren't all together. There were people who were terrified for their lives. The day after 9/11 was not this peace and joyous rainbow thing, but it's to your point of you're a bad historian because you only remember it from your perspective and your lived experience and are rejecting the notion that nope, some of us actually had it much worse than you did in that situation.
Absolutely. There were Black people when I was growing up who feared. Okay, let me say it this way. It's not only we had bombings, because that's the thing about violence to support a system. You not only have the actual violence, but you have the terror of the possibility, right? It's like when Du Bois is talking about, on being Black, it's like it doesn't happen every day, these bad things that happen to me, but it could happen.
And that's all it takes.
Right? And so there were Black people who lived in fear of being bombed. And we pride ourselves in this country on being a nation that believes in God. And there are quite a few people in this country who do and are sincere about it. But I don't think it's an accident that people were bombing churches.
No, no, it was not an accident.
Yeah. And what the church was not considered sacred, to those people, right? Else you would never. You look at Elaine, Arkansas, which was the scene in 1919 of the worst racial. It wasn't a riot. It wasn't even a war. It was a massacre.
Yeah.
Right. People coming from states and killing every Black person they could find. That started they were meeting at a church.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So it's a real, but some of us, and I'm not trying to make myself out to be somebody I'm not, but some of us have to be raising our hands and saying, okay, so that's not the way that happened.
Yeah.
Or you need to also look at this thing that did happen. And let's be fair in the way that we assess something. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that, and the 16th Street. My mother attended 16th Street Baptist Church and didn't go to church that morning,
Good. Yeah.
and so it's one of those things that,
Yeah.
for me, every time that comes up, it's one of those, I might not be here
Absolutely.
if my grandmother decided they're going to church that Sunday morning.
Absolutely.
You know, and so it's a stark reality that while I was not there, that is my history, and that's our history as a people. So moving from history, let's talk about the expansion and where the museum is going in the future, and these three pillars that you're sort of standing on. Why the shift, and what should we expect?
So I tell you, I am so excited. You know, when you get near the end of your journey, you start, kind of looking back and all, and I realized that this for me, again, it's more than just a personal thing, but it's also personal. The university is, we're building a standalone facility right now. We're in the lower level, and the irony of that is not lost on us by that. But we're right at the entrance to our campus, and that's powerful. I mean, that is so powerful. Right at the entrance to our campus, building this, and I'll actually we'll actually send you a couple of images of it. It's been designed by the same people that designed the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, where Dr. King was killed.
Okay.
And so it's outstanding. And I lost some of the battles with the designers. So my approach is more just hit people with hundreds and thousands of objects, whereas we are going to contextualize a lot of things, and then I will have my hoarding approach in the display. So we'll show about 30,000 pieces.
Wow.
I'm excited because we'll be able to tell, because we'll be 10 times larger. We'll be able to tell the story of how in a real way, how African Americans push back, and not just the usual February month people, but folks that other folks haven't heard about, like Belford Lawson, the first African American to win a case before the United States Supreme Court, who went to Ferris, by the way.
Oh yeah.
And so we're going to tell those stories. We're also going to talk about civil rights and Jim Crow in the North. So people can stop asking me, why is this museum not in Biloxi, Mississippi? And then the biggest piece of this, and a part I'm most excited about, and some of this comes from our founder, Woodbridge Ferris. His most famous speech was called "Making the World Better," and it sounds so trite and just corny, but we're going to have this ending part of the facility, which challenges visitors, first as individuals, then as communities, and then as cities and states, and then the nation. Where do we go from here? And so, in addition to the fact that we're going to have a facility to capture the stories of people, because a lot of times when people die, they take their stories with them. But we're gonna challenge every visitor to answer the question about and try to get out of some of this this politicized period that we're in right now, and just to get people to just be honest. So I tell you, I have not been this excited about anything. We actually should be built in about 2 years.
Okay.
Yeah, and considering that we're not putting a shovel in the ground for another 3 or 4 months, that's pretty fast to do it. We have a lot of friends. Henry Louis Gates is a friend of the museum. I'm trying to get him to come down and give the talk, since he didn't want to give me a bunch of money. At least he could do would be to come down and give a talk. But right now, we're already doing good work. We'll be able to do more. Right now, I don't think there's not many police departments in the state of Michigan who we have not worked with. I don't think there's many politicians that haven't been here. We have civic groups, church groups, colleges, universities. So we'll be better able to accommodate those kind of groups.
All right. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Pilgrim. This has been inspiring and enlightening in ways that sometimes worry me about our past, but give me hope for our future. If folks wanted to learn more about the museum or even to donate to the expansion, where should they go online to find more information?
Yeah, if you just go if you go online and just type in Jim Crow Museum, it'll pull up our website. Yeah.
Gotcha. All right. So, well, thank you very much, Dr. Pilgrim, for this conversation today.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking with you, and I enjoyed the conversation.